want to present Ron Henderson and his talk on the natural history of cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. So two things. One, sometimes landscapes are seen as ephemeral, right? We have seasonality and we have growth cycles. We're probably going to be looking a little bit more at geological scale. So in some senses, landscape architecture can also work really slowly. I'm also reminded of Lala Searle's discussion that landscape architecture is the slowest of the performing arts. So we're going to start in Iran, and we're going to end up at a gravelly came in Roger Williams Park overlooking the Temple of Music. So here we go. Brent, I also want to thank the Providence Preservation Society and, many of the names of many of my friends here, Colgate Searle and Barbara Sokoloff and the Kites and, everyone that's here tonight. Is really terrific to have a chance to talk a little bit about some of this work. This grows out of teaching. This is the name of a course that I teach, that I've taught for 6 years. At some point it'll be a book. I need a sabbatical to do that. It actually grows out a little bit of frustration in participating with city planning projects where, as a landscape architect, the discussion about history more or less starts with the cultural history. And so I'm always trying to bring to the attention of my colleagues in planning or architecture or other landscape architects that beneath that, the earth itself has a voice, and we're overlaying those conditions. In fact, in many cities, we're trying to figure out how to reconnect those systems. So we might want to understand how they are, in fact, originally constructed. So, in the second paragraph, this question, let us consider only this question: how does the locus urbis, once it's been determined, influence the individual and the collective? This question interests me here in the ecological sense of Sora. That is, how does the environment influence the individual and the collective? For Sora, this question was far more interesting, the opposite one of how man influences the environment. Right, so we spend a lot of time right now discussing how man influences the environment. I'm kind of interested in flipping that and understanding how the environment influences us. It also gives agency to things that are non-human. We're going to start in a small city in Iran. What I do with the students is they investigate 30 global cities every semester, and looking at these factors: geological formations, hydrological regimes, soils, volcanoes, earthquakes. Next week in class, it's Mexico City, Tokyo, Catania, and San Francisco. It's disaster week. Semnan, as you can see, is just below the Caspian Sea, just below the Alborz Mountains in northern Iran. A stream travels south out of the mountains into Semnan. It's a tiny little stream. It's only about 11 miles long at the source. Springs join the creek along the way as it travels south. A few qanats, underground water wells, join the stream as it travels south, and it ends up in the northern edge of the city. This 1956 photograph is remarkable. You can see the stream coming out from the north. You see a place where the stream splits into 5 pieces. That's a human-made splitter. Each of those streams then travels down to the north edge of the city, and you can see in blue little reservoirs. And each neighborhood has grown up around those reservoirs. And so the structure of the city, the neighborhoods of the city, are built out by a judicious and equitable sharing of a very rare water resource. The para is the name of the splitter, so I'm just going to kind of go through each step of the water system. The para is the splitter, where the single stream splits into 5. You can kind of see it best here on the right bottom. Just a couple of stones packed with some mud to distribute that stream into 5 smaller streams. The slide on the left bottom shows that as the stream gets above the splitter, before it gets to the splitter, there are a series of level terraces. Level is like a level playing field, right? It's an equalizer. And so the stream is first made kind of flat and equitable. The sides are planted with rushes and berms so that the wind doesn't make the water fluctuate. So it's a very carefully calibrated, handmade water system splitter. From the para, there are a series of canals then that continue to flow down to the city, which now is in the new part of the city, and it looks like this. So the new city has grown up around those streams, which before they were still traveling through the desert. Along the way, small blue dots are water mills. So there's a few water keepers who are situated on each of those canals as it travels to the south. Each of those water keepers, and you can kind of see those nubs of the water mills along those streams. One family, a small garden and orchard, keeping the water. And then they arrive in the reservoirs, the 6 reservoirs, which now look like this. Clearly, Latibar has suffered the most in the contemporary city. And then from the reservoirs, there are dendritic patterns that then flow out and share in the gardens and houses of the city. So it's stream, para splitting into 5, reservoirs. The reservoirs then redistribute more locally. And this is what those look like as they make their way through the city. They kind of wind between the walls of the houses. They're, an essential public space that weaves through this desert city. As those weave through, you can see one in blue there. The bath, the tekia, which is a public space built over an intersection, the public cistern and the mosque, all are oriented along those distribution systems. So I think you can see that there's a social order, civic order that's built around this water supply system. And then further below, the water dissipates into the ground, and there are a series of qanats, which are underground wells that are out in the orchards in a few of the fields to the south of the city. Evidence of this is from a scroll, the Ahmed al-Maq scroll, which you can see here, dates from the 15th century, describes the properties of this particular family. And in so doing, it provides the information that we know that this is in fact how this system was constructed. It's really rare to have written records of indigenous landscapes to give us an understanding of how they were intended to be used. So the whole system looks like this. It's a city along the Silk Road. So the Silk Road ran just south of the reservoirs. And it's a part of the Silk Road where the, go back here. Part of the Silk Road where the 2 strands from the west, one went north up to maybe Antioch, the southern one down to Cairo. Those converged more or less where Tehran is now. And they were one road as they made their way through northern Iran. Then they split again and went down to India and up to China. So Semnan is on that part of the Silk Road where the different trails of the Silk Road are one line. I'll stay there. The blue are the reservoirs. The historic city neighborhoods are in the darker purple. And you can see that the city has grown to the north. It's actually grown up into the streams. Not surprisingly, it's grown to a point where it's superseded the capacity of that water supply, and they're now trying to get water from underground. The public space system, again, is filtered down below, downstream in the water sequence. The techias, these beautiful spaces at intersections that were typically draped with fabric, are situated along those lower distribution channels. You can see one of them right there. And this is a landscape that's in threat, right? This is a kind of quintessential cultural landscape problem. This is an amazing indigenous water system that's been here for 600 years. It still existed in 1950. Actually, it was still the structure, the social structure, and the water source for the city as recently as 1960. The growth of the city has superseded the capacity of the water, and the water keepers are not politically powerful anymore, and the sequence of conservation of each of these steps of the water system is being compromised. Beijing. China. And there's this great crescent to the east. Right, China is mostly mountains to the west and to the south. There's this great crescent. What the Mark Elvin, who wrote a book called The Retreat of the Elephants, The Environmental History of China, talks about that part to the east of that arc as the good part of China. It's where there's water and resources and fish and rice. It's also where Pearl Buck was talking about the good earth. Beijing's right at the northern edge of that arc, right at the edge of the desert and the northern mountains. So we're going to zoom into Beijing. And you can see the upper part of that arc in green, this kind of fertile outwash soil. Mountains to the west and to the north, and Beijing is just snug up against the edge of the mountains. Just south of there is Zhoukoudian, the Peking man site, hundreds of thousands of year old Homo sapiens in the mountains. People have been there for a very long time. My favorite map of Beijing is this 1875 German map, where the city of Beijing is way off on the right side of the drawing, and the mountains take up 2/3 or maybe 3/4 of the entire drawing. It speaks about how important the mountains are to the shaping of Beijing. This dark black line right there, you trace that up, that's the Yongding River. And I want to talk a little bit about the Yongding River, known as the Mother River of Beijing. This is oriented the same way. You can see the, right where it says Sanhai is the Forbidden City. So the mountains are to the left and the mountains are to the north. These gray lines are ancient riverbeds of the Yongding River. Right, a river comes out of the mountains and it hits the soft plain and it meanders here. And a couple thousand years later, it meanders here. And then a couple thousand years later, it meanders here. And so this is just tracings across the contemporary city of Beijing of historic courses of the Yongding River. The orange dots and the blue dots are the location of the Imperial Gardens and of contemporary public space. Obviously, there's a correlation, right? So this is the scale of kind of my point about the natural history of cities. Here we have a city in Beijing where there's an exact correlation between the tracing of riverbeds from 10 to 15,000 years ago and the location and distribution of contemporary public space. So the ancient Qing River and The Yuan Ming Yuan, the Summer Palace, Tsinghua University, where I taught, are up in that area in the orange. Then there's the ancient Luo River, then the ancient Gaoliang River, and then the current Yongding River, including the location of the new Olympic Forest Park built in 2008 for the Beijing Olympics. And this is what some of those places look like, right? These are some of the most iconic landscapes of China and the world. The Summer Palace, harvesting grasses from the shallow lake, looking from the Summer Palace out to the West Mountains, Purple Bamboo Park, and the Olympic Forest Park, for which I was a consultant working with my good Tsinghua friends Hu Jie and Zhu Yufan, which is also the site of the first constructed wetland in Beijing. This is what the Yongding River looks like now. So we see a problem, right? But, right, the Yongding River has changed courses. It's gone dry. This isn't a feel-good story at all. Certainly, this is not something that's we should feel good about. But this is what the city of Beijing is proposing to do with the dry river, right? Is, lo and behold, another park system to grow up in the former riverbed of a river. Now, the Yongding River here didn't change course. Beijing takes about a meter of groundwater from underneath itself every year. So the water table since about 1950 has dropped a meter a year. You know, we're almost 70 years out from that. So do the math, that's 70 meters, that's 200 feet where the water table has dropped. From historically at the Yuan Ming Yuan or the Summer Palace, you essentially just needed a spade. You dug a hole in the ground and there was water. And that's how you made the gardens. You dug a hole, you piled up the soil, you built the soil around, and you had a water body in the middle. Now you'd have to excavate several hundred feet. But it's kind of remarkable to understand that there's a direct correlation between rivers that are thousands of years old, actually kind of carcasses of rivers that are thousands of years old, and still the fact that the soil still has more moisture in it than other parts of the city, and that the availability of water around which one would build a park would still be there. London. Like Providence, London is an estuary. Right? The Thames is a little bit longer than the Woonasquatucket, but not a lot. I mean, for a great city, the Thames is not the mighty river. It has a mighty estuary, however. London as it is now, but Londinium, when it was a Roman encampment, was about that large. And London is where it is for a reason. And I think every city that you investigate, when you look at the natural history of places, especially places that were slightly indigenous, pre-industrial, although I think a lot of people call the Romans industrial, the first industrialists. There's a really direct logic, a relationship between settlement and natural systems. So the Romans came, you know, Calais and Dover, we know that's the closest spot. They figured that out. You go there, and then you make your way across the land, and then to get across the Thames, you end up here looking at the gravel, silt, and sand in the floodplain of London. So the gravelly bank on the south was enough to get people out to a narrow place from which then London Bridge could be built, the first bridge across the Thames. On the north bank is gravel and slightly higher terraces. So those of you who know London know that for centuries, the city grew up on the north bank, and the south bank was much less developed. It looks something like this, maybe, in the Roman period, medieval, 17th century, and then the mighty 18th century London and the 19th century London looking something like this. And you can still kind of see to the north is the city, and to the south, kind of scruffiness. You know, it's a little bit of floodplain and less settled. So the students investigated two factors with London. One was this gravel terrace, in the sense that the city is a city built on the north side of the river. Providence was first settled, as we know, on the east side of the river, again where there was a kind of higher hill or escarpment, and eventually then part of the city, part that we're now in, was built out in the floodplain. And then the depth of the Thames. So the Roman city of London was about gravel and floodplains. The 18th and 19th century London was about how deep was the Thames and how far up could boats come from the ocean. And they essentially get up to the Isle of Dogs, which is that great kind of crescent island. And then these were all of the docks that fed the British Empire. They could come up to an area where there's about 14 to 18 feet of draw in the river. So there's a city canal on the left. So the Isle of Dogs. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call. That person has been calling me all day. The city canal is a shortcut. Takes you right to the city, but then there's a dock for exports and a dock for imports. You can see the city in the background. So we're looking kind of west. Of course, this is what the Isle of Dogs looks like now. It's the financial capital of one of the two financial capitals of the world, between New York and London. Essentially the global banking center built up where these former docks were. If you look at the institutions of London, they're all on the North Bank. Most of them are above the shallow, thin red line up onto the terrace above the floodplain. A few things like Parliament are down in the floodplain, but that was only after flood control measures like the embankment, and then the depth of the water. Okay, Providence. Providence. Just like London. We're at the top of a bay. And, you know, I think a lot of people have looked at the urban design and planning of Providence. And probably everyone here, most everyone here has at some time seen the 1974 Interface Providence Plan. And it's still, I think for me, some things are still contemporary and probably will remain. Number one is the extreme beauty of the topography, land and water forms on which the city was founded, the effect of which, although marred, is still apparent and capable of being rescued. So that's a charge to everybody here. The long courtship that the city has with its water systems, both marine and inland. The responding effects, and those are probably the two most important natural history conditions. Number three, the responding effects, some good, some disastrous, that each ensuing system of transportation has had on the shaping of the city, from boats and the filling of the harbor and the automobile. Number four, the inadvertent and unintentional perfidy that the parts of the 20th century from World War II with its program of interstate highways has dealt to this once pleasant place. And then five, the human incomprehensible scale of the city. We're kind of touch on a lot of those at CityWalk and other projects. So at the end of my class, what I want the students to do, to be able to do, is sit down at a bar with a colleague, talking about a city that they're doing a project in, and draw the natural history of that city on a napkin. To begin to just understand and convey that deep history that doesn't change so fast, so that we could understand things that might change more quickly. So Providence, like Beijing, right? So far Providence is like London, and Providence is like Beijing. There's terrain to the north and the west. There are streams that course from the northwest down to the southeast. This is the most propitious of directional flows of water in China. So, this would be a perfect Chinese city with the waters flowing out of the terrain to the hills down to the bay in the southeast. And then we have ponds in the south. That's the natural history of Providence. Hills to the north and west, streams that flow from the northwest to the southeast, and ponds in the south, edged by the great Narragansett Bay. So what do we make of that? Now what do we do? The Surficial geology map of Providence, it's a little dated. It's before the interstate highway system, so the things are kind of stitched together. The Surficial geology is really the geology since the glaciation. So it's geology that's all very young by geological standards, 15 to 18,000 years old perhaps. And so these are all ground moraines. So these are pieces with very shallow, gravelly soils or bedrock, where there wasn't a lot of material deposited as the glaciers retreated. Let's go back. So we know, I think everyone can orient themselves. We know that the Roger Williams and the early Providence settlements were on the east side of the river on one of those ground moraine bedrock locations. And essentially where the College Street Bridge is now is the Londinium moment of the Romans crossing the Thames, is right there at the College Street Bridge. But there is also the spring, the freshwater source, because in fact with so much mixed waters of salt and fresh water in the harbor, there was a need for fresh water. You have a hill, you get water falling on the hill, penetrating as shallow, gravelly soil, flowing across the underlying bedrock, and down at the bottom, it springs up. That's the spring. We're working on a project in Newport that's the same, actually that's the same problem. It's the founding spring of the city of Newport. Those of you who can orient yourself in Newport, Eisenhower Park is to the left. The Colony House is in the middle in that traffic island. The yellow box is Coffey's Citgo Station, which is the site of Newport's historic spring. We won't talk about the American story of how the founding freshwater source of a city ends up being a Superfund site, but that's an American story for sure. It is agreed in order that the plantation now begun at the southwest end of the island shall be called Newport, and that the town shall be built upon both sides of the spring and by the seaside southward. This is the records of the colony of Rhode Island from 1639. Providence, I believe, was founded in 1636. So 3 years, you win, oldest. But both cities have an understanding that the spring was really central to the founding of the city. So here's Newport, and of course it's geology. There's this Narragansett Basin, often called the Jamestown Formation, which is this brown with the hatch. And there's a little bitty piece of it that most of Jamestown is that formation. A little piece of it comes across into Newport. And the project site is right where that one little piece is. So again, Newport is a little bit like the east side. There's a kind of hill. Water goes down, falls down one side, and at the bottom there's a spring. The site is the black block, and here's probably a guess on where that underlying geology is that's then catching the water. A cross section through our site, which starts to show the spring box underground, which has been discovered when we were doing toxic soil remediation. So this is Steve Ostagai on the left from the church community housing. During the excavation of the site, a couple of large pieces of stone were discovered on the ground. They carefully picked them up, and then they looked down the hole, and there was water. The water was still there. Nobody thought the water was still there. It's not great water. You don't want to go swimming in it. You don't want to drink it. But Ictapache helped us bring some Romans, because Romans know how to go underground and find watery things. And we did investigations and LiDAR mapping, including this LiDAR map of that spring box. This describes that particular water system there. And then a kind of really early schematic proposal where we're looking at rocks and water and trees at the site of the former Coffee's Citgo station. So again, Providence, hills to the north and the west. Gravelly soils in the river bottoms. Outwash plains to the south and the east. Landfill. In geological terms, this is called artificial fill. We'll see this map a couple of times because that's what that looks like, right? This is how that happens. Taking back the land along the bay. So that's the artificial fill. And we know what that means. It's supposed to be water. It's supposed to be water. So these are great resources from Peter Stempel. Did Peter make it tonight? Many of you probably know Peter, who just has been working in visualization of sea level rise in Rhode Island. This is what he calls Hurricane Brody, which is that catastrophic hurricane that at some point will probably come. It'll be our turn at some point. This is about 3.5 hours into his modeling of that hurricane coming up through the bay. So just think if Katrina, Sandy, whichever event eventually might hit here, this would be some of the consequences. That's an hour later. What's interesting is you'll see it change along the Mashasik. So the Mashasik, So the Mashasik actually retreats. So as water comes up the Mashasik earlier, but it starts pushing up the Woonasquatucket. That's an hour later. And then, a hurricane could be a day or day and a half event. Rain coming down inland, so rain coming down the Woonasquatucket, water being pushed up the bay. And so after a day and a half, essentially it's the geological map where everything that used to be water was water and the landfill is now city. This is when I say to those of you who are interested in building the future of Providence, build uphill and build west. That's not particularly in line with building in the 195 area, except to the west of like Richmond and Chestnut. So let's move things up there. Then let's figure out how to, as we'll see, let's figure out how to bridge 95 and build that part of Providence back together. That would be my city planning napkin sketch for everyone here. And the City Department of Sustainability also understands that. This is their map. So, that map, it's kind of the same map. There are funny little pieces of other things, like a came. There's a series of cames to the south of Providence. The cluster in the middle right, of course, is clustered around Roger Williams Park. Actually, there are the cames. Roger Williams Park is the southern terminus of CityWalk, or City Play, City Eat, City Relax, City Jog, City Shop. You get the idea. I love that diagram, by the way. Connecting 7 or 8 neighborhoods, a series of really key points along each one of those neighborhoods, essentially connecting India Point Park, landfill, but then going up to an outwash plain, crossing the river, traversing an outwash plain, kind of staying on outwash plains until we arrive at Roger Williams Park, which is the most diverse geological section of the city. So it's a kind of interesting correlation between that diversity and the location of the park. So there are other initiatives in the city. There's the Woonasquatucket Greenway, there are bikeways, there's a whole series of linear initiatives happening in the city. So there's CityWalk projected over there. So you can begin to see around Roger Williams Park the diversity of geology. There are a number of different linear urban landscapes being proposed and worked on in Providence. These are terrific. CityWalk or the High Line or Promenade Plantée in Paris or Prague Boulevard in Copenhagen or the 606 in Chicago. These are new linear landscapes that transect and develop a system of public spaces through cities. A relatively recent way of building landscapes in the city. They cut across different obviously geological formations, but also different city fabric, different economic strata. And so they really are a kind of landscape that can bind cities together. So there's a whole series of those going on in Providence. Most of them are following the river. CityWalk is the unique one that goes and takes a funny kind of way of connecting because in some ways we didn't follow the natural patterns, we followed social patterns, right? There was an opportunity where 195 was removed. There was a need to connect Elmwood, Upper South Providence, and the West Side to the assets that were being developed along in the Jewelry District. So we wanted to provide a way for everyone in the city to find a way to the river. And then to connect India Point Park and Roger Williams Park, these two great parks in Providence, along a single connector. A kind of scenario looking at CityWalk, how CityWalk could simply be a kind of enhanced sidewalk condition through the jewelry district. With our proposal, originally, they would also begin to include a significant amount of green infrastructure because, again, if you look at the sea level rise maps, we should have, and unfortunately it's the past tense, we should have built streets in a different way when we were doing this because we could have made it such that the ecological services of water retention, water quality, could have been integrated into the infrastructure of the city. We didn't get there. Now it's sort of site-specific. Continues to be, advisable. And then crossing the Clifford Friendship Street Bridge, as I said, I think Providence should be looking at moving west and uphill. And certainly crossing 95 is going to be one of the critical pieces there. So reconciling what happens at the bridges from the 195 relocation will be of significant interest. Now, I am going to beat up on the city planning department just a little bit here. We've all, saw Westminster Crossing. We've seen many different versions of this. What's interesting is sort of at the same time, these three bridges were being drawn. These were new bridges. There was some funding through the 195 relocation, but for some reason we spent our attention just a little bit north of there. And I understand why, but I think we now have to remedy that attention and bring it further south to bridges that have just been built, that need to be rethought. We spent significant millions of dollars connecting India Point Park to Fox Point, money well spent. The bridge across the Providence River is going to be opening soon. Again, a significant investment by the city in connecting neighborhoods. But this neighborhood, the upper Jewelry District and upper South Providence kind of got right-out standard connections. I think we have to do better. And I think we will have to because, again, I think the city needs to move uphill. At the end of CityWalk is one of the most diverse areas of geological formations and hydrological regimes. These are often the sites of significant cultural landscapes. Roger Williams Park. I rotated Cleveland's drawing so that it oriented in the same direction. This is that same Surficial geology map that I showed earlier, zoomed in, so it's pixelated a little bit. But you can see the many colors. There's outwash plains, there's cane terraces, a little bit of ground moraine, a few other things that are all occupying that site, including some landfill. And it's within that context where the Betsy Williams farm was, happened to be in a very propitious, rich place, that Roger Williams Park was benefacted by Betsy Williams and then first designed by Cleveland in 1876 or 78. And you can see how unique those geological features are because they're only showing up on the map around Roger Williams Park. It's on one of those cames in the brown that we come to this prospect overlooking the Temple of Music. And this is the last thing that I'll be showing. 10, maybe 8 years ago, all of my Providence projects take forever. So about 8 years ago, working with Doug Still, city forester, he had me come up and look at this funny grove of trees in Roger Williams Park. So how many people know the Union Veterans Memorial Grove? There is a statue of a soldier carrying a rifle. It's a copy of a sculpture that's on the Gettysburg battlefield. Not surprisingly, this was cast at Gorham in Elmwood, so it didn't have to travel far down Elmwood Avenue to find its location in the park. Accompanying the statue are a couple of cannons and artillery shells. You can see it's sitting amongst some trees here in the postcard. If you look carefully, the ones on the left, they're kind of in a line. So this is an early photograph of that tree plantation sitting up on this came overlooking the Temple of Music. And this is our inventory of the trees. It's a little bit like a connect the dots diagram, but I think everyone can see the five-pointed star, right? So it's a grove of sugar maples planted in the shape of a five-pointed star with the cannon and the cannonballs embedded in the center. We inventoried the trees, and there you can see number 14 is missing, 7 and 8 are missing, 27, 28, 29, 30, 35 are missing. There's a group of sugar maples that are missing from this memorial cultural landscape that sits upon a unique geological formation in Roger Williams Park at the end of CityWalk. Soil compaction that would need to be repaired with probably an air spade, and then a kind of sense of how to build a path in a way that would inscribe the five-pointed star on the ground so that it would be more visible again to those who would visit. I asked Brent at the beginning if he's going to be asking for money tonight, and he said not really, so I said then maybe I can ask for money because the Parks Department would really love to restore the Union Veterans Grove at Roger Williams Park. So, when you all get your drinks tonight and you're sitting around drawing your napkins, I'm going to come around, I'm going to give a quiz, I'm going to ask everyone to draw the natural history of Providence. Right? So just a little bit of a refresher, this is the teacher in me. Remember, there are hills to the west and to the north, streams that flow from the northwest to the southeast into the Narragansett Bay, and there are ponds to the south. In closing, it's always fun to quote Wu Liangyang, who is a colleague at Tsinghua. He's now 90 years old. He's an architect who's in the 30s studied architecture at Cranbrook, just outside of Detroit. He started an academic program called The Science of Human Settlements. And at a symposium now about 10 years ago, he got up in front of a similar kind of group. And so I'm simply channeling Wu Liangyang. When he gave his keynote, I'm simply going to repeat what he said, which is we must build our cities according to our regions, and we must build our buildings according to our cities. Thanks very much.